recording.
Perfect. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest Simply People webinar. I am Danny Clark. For those of you that don't know who I am the founder of Simply People, which is an occupational health and wellbeing community that's designed to support people with challenging topics and add to your CPD and help people learn and share and support each other in a collaborative environment. Today, I'm delighted once again to have my good friend, Jodie Hill, who is founder of Thrive Law, a top performing law firm based out of Leeds, but they cover the UK. And today's topic is around how to have a difficult conversation. So you will learn on this session today some hints, tips and advice from the wonderful Jodie on how to have a difficult conversation. Jodie, over to you.
Fabulous, thank you. Just a caveat, I'm in a new office and my lights sometimes go off. So if I get up and have to run around, that's why. I haven't quite worked out how to keep them on. So when you see me flapping my arms, that's why. So thanks for the intro, Danny. It's a bit about me. So I'm obviously a solicitor, founder of Thrive Law, have my own challenges with ADHD and anxiety. And one of the things I've had to navigate is specifically communication, active listening, but also understanding as a business owner, how I have those difficult conversations, but also as an employment lawyer, helping my clients with their HR issues, with their employment issues, with their people issues, and coaching them and guiding them through how they have those difficult conversations. So that's kind of where my experience is drawn in, both from a personal experience, but also through the clients that I've supported. So any questions, please fire away. Obviously, I can't give legal advice, but what I can do is give an indication and answer any questions. If you want any more really bespoke, specific advice, and I can speak to you guys afterwards, that's not a problem if you've got like a specific issue that you want to deal with. But please do ask questions and please do interact. I'll be asking you to pop some things in the chat as we go through the session as well. So, first question, this is for you guys to answer. What difficult conversations do you think that you would face in a management, or I suppose in a HR role as well, or generally in the workplace? So if we could just pop in the chat your opinion in terms of what you consider a difficult conversation to be, and then we'll explore some of those together. Let's see if anyone's got any ideas. No, everyone's being very quiet. Okay, we've got capability, performance, yeah. Disciplinary, yeah, obviously. All of the, yeah, dissatisfaction with management, that's a really difficult one, I think. Yeah, definitely. Sickness, behaviours, basically all people stuff now. Bullying, yeah, really can be really difficult. Saying no to requests for a change of hours, or just saying no to any requests, I suppose, as well, kind of having to explain why you can't do that for somebody. Okay, here's a few more from us. So talking about mental health, we've got performance, sickness, issues at home where people might bring some personal stuff into the workplace, lateness, conduct, bereavements as well. So there's lots of different things that can happen where we feel like it's a little bit more difficult to have those conversations in the workplace, and I'll touch on a couple of those as we go through. So why do we think it's difficult to have these conversations? Well, I think a lot of the time it comes down to that people haven't had those conversations before, or they feel a bit awkward, or they feel like they don't know what to say, so they'd rather not say anything. Sometimes it's because the relationship is too close, or you don't know them well enough. Other times it's because you don't want to say the wrong thing, or you I suppose, concerned that it might blow up into something else. So it could result in a disciplinary or a grievance or discrimination allegations against you personally. So there's lots of different things why it can be difficult, but I think we've all been there, haven't we, when we're thinking, oh, and you dread it so much when you go to have that conversation, but actually it's not as bad as we always think it's going to be. But the reality is we don't always know how people are going to react in those situations. And it's that uncertainty around the conversation that makes us feel uncomfortable. So we want to feel, and we want our managers to feel empowered, knowledgeable, feel like they're prepared for these conversations, that they've got the skill set, they understand the boundaries in which they can operate, but also that they've got the support of the organisation, as well as having the toolkit to basically have these difficult conversations. So typical lawyer here is talking about some policies, but the starting point before you even have any of these types of conversations is really just to consider what the company's position is in terms of how you're supposed to have those conversations. So when we're thinking about consistency, this is not the kind of how to have the conversations, it's more about the process in which you would adopt. So just making sure that you're consistent with that process. And we'll talk a little bit about reasonable adjustments to those kind of processes where mental health, things like that come in. But generally looking at, you know, how are you supposed to invite that person to the meeting? Where is it supposed to be? Is there anything specific in those documents that you don't get tripped up on a policy or a process from a process perspective? Also just thinking, you know, in the policies, does it say they can be accompanied to a meeting? If so, does it say who? Some organisations will limit purely to a trade union rep or a colleague. Others will allow other people to come in, such as family members or somebody else to accompany them. It might be like a mental health worker or someone to accompany that individual. Obviously, where there's someone is unwell and the policy is quite restrictive in terms of how you can then have that conversation. So, for example, it might say, you know, the conversations will always happen in the office. That might not be possible because someone's on long-term sick and they have a disability or whatever. So think about how you might adjust those policies to assist you in having that more difficult conversation. But I suppose the key thing really is about consistency. Whilst you can make adjustments, and those adjustments are specific to that individual, it's really important to approach all conversations, difficult or not, in a consistent way, because what you don't want to be accused of is somebody saying, well, that person got taken out for a coffee and I was brought into the boardroom. So really thinking about how you approach those any conversations, but especially those difficult ones, because they're the ones that are likely to be contested down the line. In terms of having those conversations, always keep notes of the meetings, even when it's like an informal chat. So I always say it's important to have not only your notes, but those notes agreed with them. So it doesn't, I'm not saying you have to, like, you know, produce an entire report off the back of the meeting, but regardless of any meetings that I have, whether they're difficult or not, I always make sure that I've got some form of note to say what I said, what they agreed, you know, what the issues were, so that we can agree, so that we can agree a way forward. And make sure we're really clear about if you're actually going to record a meeting or are you going to just take notes. Make sure the individual understands what's going to happen. Obviously, if it's on a Zoom call and you're recording it, make sure that they understand that, because again, if it's a difficult conversation and they didn't know it was recorded, it's going to become more difficult when they start kicking off because you've recorded something that you don't have an agreement to do that. Making notes as well, again, if you can agree them at any stage, it's really helpful, because often with difficult conversations, it becomes he said, she said down the line. And so, well, I never said it in that way, or I didn't mean that. Maybe you can get anything agreed as you go through. I told you the lights would go off. This is going to be annoying, isn't it? 1 second, there we go, I move. If you can get anything agreed with that individual, it really does help, especially if people are struggling mentally or just generally quite distressed with whatever's happening in the workplace or at home. Often people can forget quite vital information, and people don't always perceive the situation the same way. So it's a really great way to clarify what was understood from that meeting. Even if it was informal, you could just follow it up in an email. I've got someone just commenting in the chat. Oh, so it's fine. Someone's commenting in the chat, but it was in relation to the other questions I asked. Okay, so this is a big one for me. So when we've got a difficult conversation, it's quite tempting, because usually it invokes some form of emotion for us to react to that in an emotive way. And I think it's really important that we don't react to situations whether it's a difficult conversation pending or it is already happened, or something that happens within that conversation, regardless of what time in the process it happens. Just don't react to whatever's happening. I always say respond. And what I mean by that is think about what is happening at the time, accepting the situation for what it is. Often what will happen is you simply need to speak to that individual. So say it's in advance of the situation. I always take the approach of writing it down and discussing it with someone else. So rather than internalizing it and taking an emotive view, reflecting on what's happened, why that might happen, could there be another reason, understanding what that person is actually trying to say to me before I then go into that meeting and have that difficult conversation. Now, you might not always have all that information, so that might be something that you do afterwards and you just sit and listen during that conversation. But it is helpful to, I would say, write it down and then sleep on it first, and never have difficult conversations the same day that something happens. Some people think that you should just do things straight away and deal with it at the time, and that might work for most people, but I do think 9 times out of 10, it is better to sleep on something and work towards a solution rather than simply going straight in, because often what we find is, even with the best will in the world, and we all say, well, I'm not reacting, this needs to be dealt with right now. Actually, the reality is, when you sleep on it, you do, especially the way I do it is I'll write it out, actually take a slightly different approach, and it's usually a softer approach. So have a think about your approach to a difficult conversation and your preparation that you'll do in advance. And I'll come on to some tips around preparation later. But just really think about, how can I respond, not react? It's a really important part of dealing with these more difficult conversations, because you're going to get more out of the conversation if you're not reactive. There's a book that I don't know if anyone's heard of the chimp paradox. The Professor Stephen Peters has done another book. He wrote this chimp paradox called A Path Through the Jungle. And it's a really, really great book about understanding which parts of our brain are working at the right time, and understanding that sometimes you can't have a conversation with someone if they're in chimp mode. And what they mean by that is that person is too emotional, they're too distressed, you can't have that kind of more constructive conversation. You need them to go into their human mode where you can have a rational conversation. And so again, that's why the respond, not react stuff works really well, because often that person might not be in the right frame of mind as well, not just you dealing with it, but that individual is not going to take anything that you've said with any seriousness, and they probably will just react in a more adverse way. So it's really important to think about not just how you feel, but is that person even in the right place, or do they need to go home, and do we need to reassess this situation? So one of the if anyone hasn't read this book, it is absolutely brilliant. It's got loads of exercises in on how to have like how to communicate, understanding relationships, understanding how we communicate, but also how other people do, and how we want to make sure we're both in the right place before we have those difficult conversations. So a bit of homework if anyone wants to have a look. I'm not getting any commission for this guy, but it's just a really good book. But it's also important, if someone is mentally distressed or just generally distressed at work for whatever reason. It could be that the conversation is difficult because they're not performing. It could be that they're having difficulties at home, mental health issues, whatever it is. That can be very difficult if someone starts to cry or becomes physically and emotionally distressed in front of us. So when people do start to behave in that way, it's important that we listen to them and allow them to express that for a little bit first. I think if you try and come up with solutions straight away while someone's clearly distressed, they're not going to be able to take that in. And really explore with them during that conversation, if you can, what's caused that emotion, because it might not even be what you've said. It might be that actually they're distressed because they feel like they've let you down. It might be something completely unrelated. So try to explore in quite a neutral way what they think has caused that emotion. And then you can try to agree an action plan as to how that won't happen again, so you can have a more constructive conversation. And it might be that you have to have a couple of these before you can actually have the conversation you need to have, so that it is constructive. Some people find it very, very difficult to take feedback, and they also find it very difficult to accept any criticism of what they've done. And so getting them in the wrong state is not going to get the outcome that you want. So really thinking about, the state of the individual's, the state of mind that the individual is in, as well as your own, is important before you have these conversations. It's also important to think about where to have the conversation. So if you're going to have a difficult conversation, probably wouldn't drag them in the boardroom with like a clear glass thing where everybody can see them. Really thinking about confidentiality, the environment, if you're wanting to do it like less formal. I've had situations before where I've had really difficult conversations with people in my own organisation, and actually instead of having a meeting across a table, I've opted to go for a walk with them, because it's not confrontational, because I'm not face to face. And walking side by side, it almost takes away some of what we find as the awkwardness and the difficult calmness around the conversation, and both of you can be a little bit more frank, is what I found. It's not always appropriate, you know, that, but where you obviously have to judge the environment based on the situation. And it isn't always appropriate to just drag someone into a meeting and, you know, have that conversation there and then. There's a lot of other things to consider if you want the right outcomes, and one of those is your environment. And again, even like, you know, if you're in the office, don't have that conversation in front of people. It's just thinking about how you could approach that in a way that makes that individual feel a little bit more comfortable, so that they're not going to then react badly in that meeting and make it more difficult for you. And again, just think about reasonable adjustments. So when we're thinking about environments and conditions, so with ADHD, one of the things I find really difficult is if it's noisy. So if you took me to a coffee shop to have a really difficult conversation with me, I'd find that quite difficult, because I would be able to hear other people's conversations, and that would be very distracting for me. Other people would prefer that because they find it less formal. So it's kind of understanding, you know, if someone does have a disability, do they need adjustments to accommodate them for that meeting, so that, or that conversation, so that you can have that in a more constructive manner. And, you know, so I've talked about reasonable adjustments a lot, but I do think it's important, especially because most reasonable adjustments, people tend to raise things like mental health. So, you know, if the environment's being adjusted, great. But again, thinking about the policy, are you going to allow someone to bring somebody else to the meeting that's not allowed in the policy because actually they're really struggling with their mental health? So we're going to allow them to bring their partner with them, or their mental health advisor, or something like that, so that you've got, I suppose, that conscious that you're conscious that you've done what you could to accommodate that individual, to put them on an even playing field. But also, you know, even things like providing information beforehand. And I suppose the key thing is, rather than assuming what people want in terms of adjustments, is if you think it's going to be a difficult conversation, you know someone has got a disability or is particularly distressed, ask them how you could make them feel more comfortable. It doesn't have to be framed as a reasonable adjustment necessarily. And whilst there's a legal obligation to make reasonable adjustments for disabled people, you don't have to put it as a reasonable adjustment. It can be, you know, we want to make this, we want to, I don't know, make this as comfortable as possible for everybody to have this conversation. So yeah, I think ultimately when it comes to adjustments, whilst there is a legal obligation, fine, you know, you need to comply with that, but try and think how you can make it more comfortable for them, because actually if that person feels more comfortable, they're less likely to make it difficult for you. So the most important thing is listening. It's really, really, really important when you're having a difficult conversation to listen, because it will only become more difficult when that individual feels unheard. And we've all been there, when someone cuts you off, where someone just listens but then responds with something completely different because they're not actively listening. And all they wanted to do was just tell you what they wanted to say, and that was it. And there's nothing more frustrating when you're in those types of conversations. So you want to really create an open environment where they feel that they can say what they want to say as well. It's not just about, this is a difficult conversation, it's not a difficult dictation. So, you know, you need to, I always say we've got 2 ears, 1 mouth. So we've got to listen twice as much, and that you will find that the conversation will go better where you listen more. You know, make the environment so that it's not you versus them, it's not us and them, the company and the individual. Try to remove that emotion that I talked about at the beginning, because, you know, often difficult conversations arise because somebody's done something wrong or something has happened, and you're trying to deal with that situation, and we don't know what's going to happen. That person might leave, they might go on long-term sick, they might put a grievance in. So that can cause emotion, especially if it's your own business or it's against someone that you know. So trying to stay neutral and actually use that conversation as a way to absorb what's happening, but also then try to, I suppose, build that relationship so you're not breaking it down. Because often what can happen is you go to these meetings and someone will have a difficult conversation, and actually it ends up worse than it was before the conversation started. So if you can start the conversation with the right environment by making adjustments, by agreeing how the format of the conversation or the meeting will go, and then by actively listening, you're creating an environment where someone is more likely to be receptive to positive feedback, receptive to what you're saying, and is more likely to be open and honest with you, answering the questions that you need answering. So think about that when when you're having these conversations, but also think, are you the right person? Because sometimes you're not the right person, and it could be that that's because you're too close to that individual, so you're not able to be objective, or it might be that you're too emotionally involved, because you recruited that individual and you don't want to have to do this conversation. So think, sometimes that you don't have the choice, and that's how it is. But if you have the option to consider, are you the right person for that conversation, then do that. The other thing is you can think about is, if you are a small organization, is there someone external that you could bring in? Not suitable for every conversation, but it might be, that someone's raised a grievance and everybody's kind of involved. They're not really, but actually the company's too small for you to objectively have that difficult conversation with them. So it could be that you appoint someone independent to have that conversation with them. And that then can remove a lot of the animosity, because they feel like they're being heard because you're taking it seriously. So again, thinking about the environment and the individual and how they might respond to the situation. It's very difficult because every situation is very, very different, and every individual is. But these are just ideas of things to think about when you're approaching some of these more challenging conversations. Now, I say for the most part, assume people are being honest, because the reality is they usually are. However, you're always going to have people who swing the lead. You're always going to have people who are being performance managed and then say, oh, well, now I have a mental health problem, or, oh, well, now I'm not, now I can't do this because it was because of you. But actually, it's never been raised before. And it's very knee jerk because of what's been happening in terms of their own conduct or their own performance. And so that can be very difficult to manage. Oh, we go again. Here we go. I'm going to make sure I'm in a different room next time, I promise. And so when that happens, again, that's going to cause a further difficult conversation. But the reality is you still need to deal with that in a way that you would deal with anyone else who raises a grievance or who alleges that there's a mental health condition. So, it's very difficult, even though it looks as though it's a knee-jerk reaction, you still have to, I would still recommend you deal with it in a way that is consistent with how you would deal with anybody else. Because most people will be honest. So even, sometimes we can have a bit of an unconscious bias where we're going, actually, I don't think that might be this, that they're only raising it now because of this. Well, the reality is they might only be raising it because they didn't feel comfortable raising it before. So again, try not to make those assumptions early on. Try to lead with empathy with some of the conversations that you're having. Obviously, people do things wrong, people make mistakes, and often most people are doing it with the best intentions in the world. And actually, the reality is that hasn't actually resulted in the performance that they wanted, or the situation has ended in a way that they hadn't planned for. So, be mindful of that, people, nobody's perfect. And whilst they may have made, someone may not be performing, or they may have be in a disciplinary process, or whatever the reason might be, try not to get too bogged down in that, and understand and listen to what, that individual is saying, as what the reasons were, and what they're going to do to improve. Try to be really clear in terms of what the conversation is about. Often when we have a difficult conversation, people go around the houses and don't actually say what they want to say. Again, your preparation is really important for that. So if you can prepare in advance what you're going to say, why you're saying it, and what's the objective of having this conversation. So you've got like the what you're going to say, but why are you saying this, and what are you trying to achieve from this conversation? Really understand that beforehand, so that you can be as clear as possible, so that things don't get lost in translation, because it's something that's very, very common in these more emotive conversations. So I've already touched on, when someone is more distressed, allow them to express that emotion in a kind of a more constructive way. But I think it's important to consider, is that person still okay to work? Is that person okay to continue with this conversation? And where you think that either you or somebody else is not okay to continue with that conversation, it's sensible to stop it there and rearrange it, so that you don't end up in a worse position. And what we find often is, usually it's one or the other, or sometimes both individuals can end up feeling quite emotive in certain situations. So it's being able to have the confidence to say, I think we need to stop this meeting now. let you have some time to calm down, or whatever's happened in the meeting. It might be that they're emotional, might be that they're angry, however they've reacted, and then decide whether you need to have that next conversation, or whether they need to have it with somebody else. So I mentioned unconscious bias earlier, and the reason why I think this is really relevant is, first of all, we're not aware of it. That's the whole point of the unconscious element of it. And it's something that can be triggered in these more difficult conversations. So it's important that if you haven't already had unconscious bias training, that you have regular training, and you will then start to see how you can try to challenge some of those unconscious biases in the way that you communicate with individuals. So, for example, some people may have an unconscious bias around mental ill health. That's like something, they might have a conscious one, but understanding what some of your either conscious or unconscious biases are really important before you go into some of these conversations, because you don't want to be led by that. You want to make sure you're as objective as possible, and obviously as calm as possible as well in those situations. And if you do have an unconscious bias that you're not aware of, that people might trigger during that conversation, that could obviously make the conversation much more difficult, which we absolutely want to be avoiding. So dealing with dishonesty, touched on it already, but I think it is important to understand that people can be dishonest, will be dishonest, will continue to do that and damage relationships. But the point of the conversation, again, it comes back to, what's the objective of this conversation? If they're being dishonest, you need to try and stay as calm as possible. Again, go back to the don't react, just respond. So it might be that you just have to actively listen and understand what it is that they're saying, even if it is a lie and you know it's a lie. Just collate as much evidence as possible and try to keep it as neutral as possible when explaining why you think it's a dishonest statement. So it might be that, during a conversation, someone says something, it's a lie, go away then and investigate that, rather than saying simply straight away in that meeting, well, yeah, it's an absolute lie, and, reacting in a way that's obviously not going to be helpful. But also consider, is that dishonesty something that you then want to take a formal approach on? Does that mean that it warrants a disciplinary? What was the dishonesty? And also, why were they dishonest? Was it because something else has happened, or, not to say that, you can always justify lying, but sometimes it could be related to an underlying condition. Sometimes it could be related to something else at home, where they just couldn't tell the truth about something because of something else that's going on. Just think about that when you're dealing with these more difficult conversations. I'm not saying that it justifies anyone being dishonest in the workplace, but it is sometimes important to consider why they might have done that, and that might change your approach. So with these difficult conversations, always leave with a plan. So I said at the beginning to take notes and agree those notes. It's important that you have a plan, because obviously when you go in, what you're going to be doing is creating an environment where you want people to be open, honest, where you can say exactly what you think, and you can retrieve the information that you need to achieve the objective of that difficult conversation, right? So at the end of that, you need to leave with a plan. So that is, how are you going to support them, if at all? What are they going to do to change? So anything that's been agreed in that conversation needs to be followed up in writing, and try to understand, is there any, if someone's struggling with mental health, what signposting have you given them? What have you said they're responsible for? What are you responsible for? When are your next meeting? Is there another conversation? Is there a formal process that will follow? So be really clear what the plan is moving forward after that conversation, and make sure that's clearly communicated to the individual, so that they understand exactly what the next steps are. So I've got a little checklist here, which I thought might be helpful for you guys. So when, obviously this is more mental health related, but actually I think most of the difficult conversations tend to have some level of mental health issues in them, not least because most people are stressed in those situations. So I think this will be relevant for most of the conversations that you'll be having. So first of all, where you've got your, where we're obviously specifically looking at mental health here, is mental health talked about at all levels of the business, looking individually with one-to-ones with managers. So one of the things that we do at Thrive is we have to, I suppose, avoid having as many difficult conversations in our one-to-ones. We've integrated full feedback for management, but also we ask about their mental health in every one-to-one. So the first question is, how's your mental health? How's your well-being? How's your workload? So those conversations are at the forefront of everything that we do, to almost avoid having those difficult conversations, so that they didn't feel they could tell us about the mental health and then they don't perform, and then we have to have the difficult conversation. We keep on top of it that way. And again, we discuss that quite openly as a department. We have different bits of tech that we use to help us to check in on mental health, but also how we feel on a day-to-day basis, so that we encourage reflection and open conversations with all of our staff. All of us have had training as well. So again, do you train your line managers how to have conversations around mental health with their staff? Because again, if you can have the conversations around mental health, you're probably more likely to be able to have that more difficult conversation. But the type of training that you could have: mental health first aid, mental health champions, management training on how to have those conversations for the line managers or the senior management teams. If people haven't had that, it might be something to consider. And obviously, again, just considering things like remote working as well. Like if you're having a conversation that's difficult or around mental health, do people have access to everything when they're working from home? I know that the remote working, Boris has said from next week, no more home working, but the reality is lots of people will still have that arrangement in place. So just consider that when you're considering those conversations. Okay, next one is recognize. So do you take action to identify stress in your organization, such as sending out surveys or doing risk assessments for well-being or stress or mental health? Is that something that you do in your organization? If you don't, it might be something that you want to consider doing. And then when you do start to do that, you can review the relevant data and start to see how implementing some of this stuff earlier on can actually help you decrease the difficult conversations and the complaints and the grievances that are happening. So you can use that data over time to help you not least show the staff that it's helped, but also show the management team that the investment has been a positive investment. The other thing, obviously from MHFA, you can learn this as well, but through mental health champion training, you can train your managers how to recognize signs of stress in the staff. Again, to have those conversations earlier. What we find is if you can recognize the signs of stress and have an informal conversation and support someone, you're much less likely to end up in a situation where they're not performing or they are going off on long-term sick and having to have the much more difficult conversation if you can spot that much earlier. But also, having a think about, can we spot that in ourselves? There's an element of self-awareness here. And when I talked about respond, not react earlier, that's about us recognizing in ourselves that sometimes we do respond to things, like we're human. And I said about the book before, our chimp will respond. So it's about having that self-awareness and spotting signs in ourselves, because if we're in a really stressed state as managers, what will happen is we're much more likely to react, not respond. And so we need to spot the signs of stress in ourselves and make sure that we're training everyone in the organization to be able to do that. So not just management level, but all staff. But I think it's particularly important for managers to be able to spot that, so that we're in the right frame of mind when we're trying to deal with these difficult situations. So here's the classic response that I have alluded to on numerous occasions. So really encourage people to respond, encourage managers to listen to what's being said rather than trying to offer excuses, explanations, and just trying to offer the solutions before they've heard what's actually happening. If an employee is experiencing stress or mental health problems, we always say to try and signpost them. It might be that you've got a mental health first aider, occupational health, simply people, or it might be that there's someone within the organisation that they can talk to. If not, signpost them externally. But when you're responding to individuals, once you've actually sat and listened to them actively, you then need to think about where you're signposting them. And obviously, if you do have anything internal like a council service, an EAP or anything like that, then making sure that they have access to that and they know how to access it. Sometimes organisations have all of this support in place and then people don't know about it. So just make sure that's really clearly communicated. Then reflect on what's happened. So, if you're monitoring, so say you're doing surveys, around mental health and well-being, and you have the data for that, make sure that you're reflecting on, first of all, what the results of that data were, and explaining to the staff how you've used that data. So say, for example, I don't know, we've done a mental health risk assessment, and we do them three or four times a year. And the results of that, what we do is we don't know the individual's risk assessment, we get the company's risk assessment. And what happens as a result of that is we understand that, say, 80% of our staff are struggling with sleep. So we can start to invest in the right space within the workplace so that we're supporting individuals. So have a look at the data that you're collecting, reflect on the training that you've had, reflect on the individual. There we go. Reflect on the individual feedback that you get if you're doing it as an individual survey, but if you're doing it as a more global risk assessment, using that information, so that actually individuals don't just feel like you're asking them all of these questions and not using that information properly. Then make it routine to ask people how they are. We do this using an app called Loopin. You can basically tag it on to things like, I think it integrates like Microsoft Teams and Slack and WhatsApp and places like that. So basically when you log in, it asks people how they are. Obviously that's a less direct way of asking someone because it's an emoji popping up on an app that they already use, but also encouraging people to reach out. If you can find out how people are, you're much less likely to be in a situation having those difficult conversations if you know how they're feeling earlier on, because you can put that support in place. And as I said before, in our appraisals, which we do on a monthly basis, we have the regular check-ins for mental health. So is there something that you can do that's more formal, that there's a safe space for people to check in and provide feedback on their own mental health, but also on management? So there's a little bit more there on mental health stuff, but I'm conscious of time. So I'm going to just go, and we've already talked about adjustments, so I'm just going to just skip ahead. So I want to talk about avoiding issues where it can be a little bit clumsy. So when we have a difficult conversation, again, we can be sometimes reactive or say the wrong thing. Sometimes people say things like these things on the slides, which are not helpful. So, it's really important that we avoid these types of things in any conversation, let alone a difficult one, not least because it can result in further complaints, but also discrimination allegations, especially if it's like, now you're having a baby, you won't be able to work as much, that type of thing. So if you're having a more difficult conversation where something like, maternity, pregnancy, that type of thing, or there's a disability, or there's some form of misconduct or anything like that, just be really mindful of the more clumsy things that can kind of trigger claims and complaints against us individually, but also as a company. So, and when I say individually, discrimination can occur where an individual complains about the conduct of an individual. The company's liable, but the individual is also personally liable if they decide to pursue a claim. So it's really important from your own perspective, but also to protect the company. The main thing that tends to come up is it's harassment, or it could be that they say, well, you've not made a reasonable adjustment during the process, the dismissal process, the capability process. You could have done this, you could have done that, therefore I'm now raising a grievance. So that difficult conversation becomes 10 times more difficult because now you've got a disciplinary and a grievance and a whatever it might be. So trying to, again, the type of language that you use, considering adjustments in advance is really, really important. The worst case scenario is that either you then proceed to a dismissal and then they say, well, actually it's unfair, or that they resign in response to something that's said in the conversation because they say, well, actually that is a fundamental breach of contract because it's discrimination and therefore I'm leaving. Or it's the last straw because they've already had lots of other issues with, they might have already raised a grievance about some bullying. Then the way that the grievance is handled in that difficult conversation is then resulting in them resigning and claiming constructive dismissal. So just be really mindful of that. I mean, obviously, I think most people are, but again, that personal liability from the discrimination angle, again, is something that people are not as aware of. So just be mindful of that. Okay, preparation is key. I think every single time I've ever done a difficult conversation, even with clients, actually, I actually prepare a script for people. So if it's a client, I'll make sure that they've got, this is the objective. These are the types of questions that you want to ask. This is this is why you're asking these questions, and then a bit of a script in terms of how they might approach that meeting. So, you can do that for yourself. Or you can get advice on how to do that if you're really unsure, especially where there's more like legal elements to that difficult conversation, or if you think there's a risk of discrimination because they've got a mental health problem, or they're on maternity leave and they've raised a grievance. Where it's more complex, make sure you're really clear about what the purpose of that conversation is and trying to stick to that. Don't go off on a tangent. And obviously, if you feel really uncomfortable and you need to stop that conversation, think about yourself as well. If you're feeling as though you've done all the preparation in the world and you've set the right environment, you've put all the adjustments in place, but actually this is becoming very uncomfortable, make it clear that that's the case to the individual. Stop the meeting, get yourself out of the meeting, and rearrange it with a more suitable person if that's the case. So, any questions? I think we've got a couple of questions that have come through the chat, actually. Someone's put, love Professor Peters and his books. They are very good if you haven't read them.
He does one for children as well. I don't know, for anyone that has got kids, he's wrote a book for.
Yeah, he does one for children to try and help them explain anxiety, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really, really good, really useful.
Really, really good.
And Vicky says she has to go, but if she can get the slides and recording after, which of course people can. Thank you, Jodie. That was really helpful.
I've also put on the book recommendation, I've put a link there to the on the slides to the book, but it's also got some other recommendations of books that I found helpful. And then there's all my social and bits on there if anyone wants to follow, because I talk about this stuff all the time.
Absolutely. Are there any questions, anybody in the room?
Also, Ula's just recommended a book saying talking tools strategies. Oh, yay, thank you. Thanks, Ula. I'll keep that one. I'll add that to my reading list. I wanted to keep, so I've just clicked on it. There we go. Stop share. There we go. I've just I just clicked on the book. I know. I was trying to copy it, but it won't copy.
I've got it, don't worry.
Got it. Okay, cool.
I've got it. But no, thank you, everybody. That was really good. Jodie, as always, it was really interesting. I hope that everyone on the call enjoyed the session. I'm sure they found it useful. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Daisy. Hopefully, we'll see you on the 10th of February, which is our next Simply People webinar. Please do share if you've enjoyed it. Hopefully, you'll be linked in with myself or Jodie. Thank you for turning up. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall I stop the recording then? Yep.
Yes.
There we go.